Hello, my name is Larry Siegel, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Howard Simon today. And one of the things I found out about Howard as I went through his biography is that we were both born in the Bronx and we both went to City College. So we're brothers. However, that's where we depart. Howard went on to get a PhD at the University of Minnesota, and he was taught at Minnesota and then at DePauw University. But even more importantly for us, he served as the longest running state executive director in the history of the American Civil Liberties Union. 23 years in Michigan and 21 years as the executive director here in Florida. And during this 44-year stint with the ACLU, he was involved in many, many high-profile issues and cases. I can only mention a couple. He worked on the school vouchers issue, abortion rights issue. He worked with people on school book and library censorship and the right of gay men and women to marry and to adopt children. But one thing which is so relevant today is he worked on voting rights, which he actually began in 1965 when, as a college student, he went to Selma, Alabama for the Montgomery March for the passage of the Voting Rights Act. So he led a team that drafted the 2018 constitutional amendment to restore voting rights to former felons. And he worked on challenging the legislature's restrictions on voter registration and early and Sunday voting, among many other activities. He retired from the ACLU and started the Clean Okeechobee Water Foundation to work on policy change in Florida to protect us from pollution and reduce the red tide, I hope. And he and his wife, Beth, now live on Sanibel. Today, he will be addressing a topic that is very important, and is voting rights and the threat of control over them to the American democracy. And before I turn it over to Howard, I just want to mention that if you have any questions, please click on during the talk Q&A or after, write your question down. I will then give Howard the question when he's finished his presentation. So without further ado, I will turn the podium over to Howard Simon and let him discuss voting rights today.
Thank you, Larry. And thank you for this invitation. I certainly wish that someday we'll do this in person, and it would be a lot easier to do that. So I want to ask you to bear with me because there is an enormous amount of material here, a lot of moving parts, a lot of recent events. A federal judge 10 days ago issued a mammoth 288-page ruling by a federal judge. And so there's a lot of history that you need to know to understand where we are and the current controversy. So let me begin by saying that most of my involvement in voting rights issues has been through, as Larry mentioned, through the ACLU, and that's been through nonpartisan voting rights work. And that work involves protecting the right of all voters, which is sometimes distinct and conflicts with the partisan interests of candidates and parties. For example, when the two major parties gang up and enact laws that try to restrict the participation of minor political parties. So partisan politics usually involves parties jockeying for partisan advantage. Both parties, I have to say, have played this game in the past. I think the dirty secret of American politics is not only get out the vote of your supporters, but also do what you can to depress the turnout of your opponent's supporters. But I want to say that this talk recognizes the partisan realities of the current crisis in voting rights, in which restrictions on voting have been advanced by one party, namely Republicans, and resisted by another, namely Democrats. So to begin, I want to urge you to think about voting rights as something that's part of the heart and soul of the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King said that the history of voting rights in the United States is in large part the history of white people in power devising endless ways to keep Black people from casting a ballot. 8 years even before the passage of the Voting Rights Act, King famously said, "Give us the ballot and we will no longer have to worry the federal government about our basic rights." Voting has been a battle in the United States since the founding of our country. It has been a struggle of who is included in the Constitution, who gets a seat at the table. It started with white male property owners only, but then formerly enslaved Blacks demanded rights, then women, then young people, and college students. The fight to end barriers to full participation in our society was always largely about the power of the vote. And I want to say also, by way of introduction, that this history is not only about legal battles fought in courtrooms and legal victories built one on another. It has been a bloody battle. Black people were lynched and killed if they tried to vote or even to register to vote. Women got the right to vote, but only after decades of protests, enduring jail and hunger strikes, and even brutal forced feeding while in jail. My work on voting rights, as Larry indicated, spans more than 50 years, from the time I spent in Selma in 1965 as a college student, serving as an assistant to the Reverend Andrew Young in the basement of Brown Chapel in the campaign to pass the Voting Rights Act. Then as a college teacher, helping students vote in their college town, to more than 4 decades with the ACLU, as Larry mentioned, as executive director in both Michigan and Florida. I was immersed in campaigns to ensure that votes were protected by reliable paper ballot voting systems, by passage of the Fair Districts amendments to ban partisan gerrymandering, and the effort to end the largest voter suppression measure in the country, Florida's lifetime voting ban. As Larry mentioned, I led the team that drafted the constitutional amendment to restore voting rights and helped organize the ballot campaign that changed the Florida Constitution. So in this talk, I want to try to do 4 things and try to get it all in as quickly as possible and have a good conversation afterwards. I want to review what's happening around the country and in Florida. I want to bring you up to date on 3 distinct Florida voting issues: vote by mail, voting restoration, and the redistricting controversy. I want to thirdly offer some thoughts about why this is happening. And I want to end with about 10 suggestions about what we can do about it. So let me go through, and some of this is tracked by my PowerPoint. So you can see that famous quote from Justice Earl Warren back in 1969 about how the threat to voting rights is by not only suppression, but by dilution of the power to vote. So I developed this inventory on how voting is manipulated in the United States in 4 different ways. One of the things I want you to appreciate is, you got to give them credit. There are just endless imaginative ways in which, because this is really about who holds power, but endless imaginative ways to try to figure out how to manipulate voting. So I don't want to dwell on a lot of this. Some of this I'm going to go into more detail, but I just want to just list and maybe mention in more detail some of these things. Some I'm going to go into more detail. So these are policies that erect actual barriers to voting. Many of these will sound familiar, look familiar. and this is still part of the same list. Secondly, there are policies and practices that dilute the power of voting. And again, many of these look familiar, gerrymandering, and I'm going to talk more about that in election in a little while, but there are lots of these other ways that do that, that you'll recognize on this list. And I apologize, but my point is just to skip over this. I'm going to go back in more detail on some of these selectively. Then there are policies and actions that I call put the thumb on the scale. This is mostly done by third parties, mainly partisan operatives, and many of these you'll recognize as well. The one that's not, I might mention, because many people, and I'm trying to do this talk for many of you who are, I'm presuming, maybe part-time residents of Florida or recent residents of Florida, and you are not familiar with all the imaginative ways in which voting is manipulated in Florida. So look, the next to last one, ballot order. You may not know this, for example, but there is a Florida law that requires that the order in which candidates appear on the ballot is in the order based upon the political party of the incumbent governor. So for each of the offices that you have to vote on, whatever the party of the incumbent governor is, it begins being listed with that political party. And I mention that because there is evidence of a statistical advantage of being listed first on the ballot. The last way that I want to mention here is the loss of votes that are a result of maladministration of voting systems, and we're all too familiar with this in Florida. Bad ballot design. You may, whether you lived in Florida or not, if you lived anywhere in the world, you heard about the 2000 Palm Beach County butterfly ballot, or even more recently in 2018, Broward County had its U.S. Senate race begin under a full column of instructions that thousands of people skipped, and there was a major undervote in Broward County in that particular race, which accounted in significant part for the defeat of former Senator Bill Nelson. I want to focus for a little while on some of the manipulative devices that are particularly occurring in Florida. So there's gerrymandering, but I'm going to skip over that for a second. Gerrymandering was supposed to have been limited, or partisan gerrymandering prohibited by the Fed Districts amendments that the people of Florida enacted in 2010. The felon disfranchisement is the major way, and I'll be talking about that in more detail, but that is the nation's principal voting suppression device, and mainly here in Florida. 1 out of every 4 people in the United States that are barred from voting because of a prior felony conviction live in the state of Florida. If you've been reading the newspapers, we have non-party affiliated ghost candidates that are secretly funded for the purpose of confusing voters and siphoning votes off from a disfavored incumbent or some other candidate. So I say that these are secretly funded, but I have to say that fabulous investigative journalism, largely by the Orlando Sentinel, has uncovered that these ghost candidates that defeated some incumbent senators were funded by FPL, Florida Power and Light, and Big Sugar. So it was the corporations that defeated some of these. So what else is here that's worth mentioning? The phony write-in candidate. We particularly are victimized by this in Southwest Florida and in other parts of the state that are politically homogeneous. That is where only one party fields candidates for an office. So in effect, the primary becomes the general election. Whoever wins the primary becomes the holder of the office. And somebody can get, and in fact, candidates frequently recruit a relative or a campaign worker or a friend just to put in their name as a write-in candidate, and the write-in candidate closes the election so that only members of that political party can vote in what is in effect a general election. I mentioned ballot order. There's a manipulation of the timing of special elections. This, I thought, was a particularly vicious activity that occurred by our governor here. Several members of the legislature had to resign in order to run for the congressional seat in Broward and Palm Beach County that was vacated by the death of Congressman R.C. Hastings. And there's a law that requires you to resign when you're running for another office. They resigned, but the governor delayed the scheduling the primary election, which is a necessary precursor to the general election. And as a result of that, several districts in the Senate and in the House of Representatives in largely Democratic and largely minority districts went unrepresented in the last session of the Florida legislature. And I thought that was particularly atrocious. So here is examples of some of the phony ghost candidates, that propaganda that was put out. And here I just want to point out the one on the left indicates that this person, Alex Rodriguez, is masquerading as a progressive candidate. He was recruited because the incumbent was somebody named Jose Javier Rodriguez. And so he was recruited to confuse voters, pretend to be an equally progressive candidate. And this candidate, who never campaigned, who never did anything, in fact, some of the ghost candidates even left the country. The one in and around Orlando is now living in, and was living during the election, in Sweden. But this particular candidate, Alex Rodriguez, got 6,000 votes. The incumbent, Jose Javier Rodriguez, lost the election by 32 votes. So you can see some of the effect of this. So let me turn to the three distinct Florida issues. Vote by mail, and I want to begin with vote by mail. I'll try to do this as quickly as I can. Half of all the proposed restrictions that the country is now dealing with are vote by mail, and this is a response to the 2020 election. Some of the restrictions deal with barring sending out vote by mail applications, how frequently a voter must apply for a vote by mail ballot, the availability of drop boxes, and so on. A major contributing factor to the high turnout in 2020 was the use of vote by mail. More people voted by mail in 2020 than in any previous election. So the conversion from absentee voting to no excuse vote by mail, which we have in Florida and many other states, and the use of drop boxes, these were accommodations to protect the right to vote during the pandemic. That the turnout in the middle of a pandemic was so high is, I think, nothing short of a civic miracle. Now, one problem with vote by mail is not, as the former president says, voter fraud. In fact, it is exactly the opposite. It's the tossing of legitimate votes by eligible voters for two basic reasons, namely the failure to timely return the ballot, and because there's a signature problem. The person forgets to sign the back of the envelope, or there's a mismatch in the signature and that the person sends in, and what the election officials have on file. So the law requires that the ballot is due by 7 p.m. on election day, not that it's postmarked by election day. It actually has to be received. I think this is a problem maybe that's worth fighting for. If a ballot is postmarked by election day, why should the voter be victimized by the inefficiencies of the U.S. Postal Service? And if you think that this is a fanciful concern that I have, let me just tell you that in the November 2021 Democratic congressional primary that I referenced a little while ago in Broward and Palm Beach County for the congressional seat, that primary in a heavily minority, heavily Democratic district, so the winner of the primary would be the elected, in effect, the elected member of Congress. That primary election was decided by 5 votes. The newspapers, the Broward Sun-Sentinel, then found 300 unopened, undelivered ballots in the Broward County Post Office. So I think this is, again, why should a voter be victimized by the inefficiencies of the Postal Service if they got their ballot postmarked by election day? The second problem is a signature problem, mismatch or missing signature. Here, Florida law is helpful because supervisors of elections have an obligation to track the person down and give them 2 days to cure their ballot, come in and re-sign it or sign it for the first time. So I want to say that despite the claims of a flawless election by our governor, nevertheless, he caved into pressure from his base and insisted on more restrictions on vote by mail in the 2021 legislative session and in this recently closed 2022 legislative session. In 2021, the bill was passed that restricted vote by mail applications. It restricted the use of drop boxes. It banned and imposed criminal penalties for what they call ballot harvesting. It also required that it required third-party voter registration organizations, principally the League of Women Voters, but a number of others that operate in the minority community, to notify the people, to tell the people as they're signing them up to register to vote, to tell them that they may not be able to get their ballot, their voter registration application in time. They might want to consider delivering it themselves to the supervisor of election. They can't be responsible for it. Needless to say, this compelled speech was insane, frankly, if there was a First Amendment in this country. And so in the 2022 election, better minds can control the legislature if that's possible, and that particular provision was repealed. I want to say the story about the Senate Bill 90 and the 2021 election says everything you need to know about voter suppression in the United States, because Senator Dennis Baxley, who was the chief sponsor, said in support of it that the bill was needed to prevent fraud, and despite the absence of any evidence of fraud. And on signing the bill, Governor DeSantis claimed that, and I quote, "Floridians can rest assured that our state will remain a leader in ballot integrity." Then emails and text messages later revealed that their concern was actually partisan. Because of the pandemic, Democrats, for the first time in our history, exceeded Republicans in the number of vote by mail applications. And the emails revealed that their real motivation was to cut into the Democratic lead in vote by mail signups. In other words, they lied to the people of the state of Florida. So Senate Bill 90 was challenged, and just on the 31st, 10 days or so ago, The Chief Judge of the U.S. District Court issued a monumental 288-page ruling. And I'm not going to try to summarize this, although I want to go through some highlights of this. So look, here are the essential elements of the Judge Walker's ruling on March 31st. Any warning that they have to, that third-party voter registration organizations have to provide to those that's enjoined. The prohibition on assistance to voters within 150 feet of the polls, that means can they give them water? Can they approach them? That's enjoined. Limitation on county supervisors of elections use of drop boxes. There were limits that it could only be during the hours and had to be monitored all the time by a staff member who was there. That's enjoined and so on. Now, the next to the injunction was denied, and that is the requirement that a person make a request every election cycle, every federal election cycle, which is 2 years, rather than 2 election cycles every 4 years, which was the system before Senate Bill 90, and an increased voter ID requirement for a request for a vote by mail ballot. So those are still in place, and the restriction on voter assistance with what they call ballot harvesting, where you can collect ballots and deliver them for people other than members of your immediate family. That was part of another lawsuit. It was not addressed in this lawsuit, and it stays in place. I know there's a lot of text on this thing, but I want to point out the significance of this paragraph in which the judge says that what we are facing in Florida is essentially 20 years of racially motivated voter suppression in the state of Florida. Now, this is interesting because this is the intersection of politics and race. This is not because of any hostility to Black people. This is not old-fashioned racism, animosity to Black people. It's as he says, a toxic mix of racially polarized voting in close elections, and it's racially motivated voter suppression because of the propensity of Black voters to vote to favor Democratic candidates. So that is the reason that he is pointing to. And part of his ruling is, this part is now, I have to say, extraordinary. We can talk about whether this opinion is likely to stand up when the governor appeals it to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, but this part is extraordinary. There's a provision of the Voting Rights Act that allows a judge to opt a state in to a pre-clearance requirement when they have a history of racially motivated voter suppression. And that's what the judge did. So the judge said any other provisions that the legislature may enact addressing the 3 that he enjoined, the warning to people who are registering to vote, the use of drop boxes and providing assistance within 150 feet, any changes to that would have to be cleared by the federal court before they can go into effect. So that's where we are now, and the governor is going to appeal, and we can chat about that later. The second thing I want to talk about is the voter suppression tactic of disenfranchisement of people with a prior felony conviction. This is a piece of advertisement that we developed early on in the campaign to change the Constitution. So this has been a battle, frankly, since the state of Florida amended its constitution to put in the system of lifetime felon disfranchisement in the 1868 Constitution, in order to try to take the right to vote and the power away from the freed slaves. So it begins there. And this has been an ongoing, continuous battle. I want to say that, and I can't help but notice, I added this because it's almost 15 years to the day. The most significant change that occurred since the 1868 Constitution, when the state was forced to rejoin the Union and amend its constitution, but the state nevertheless put in the system of lifetime felon disfranchisement. The most significant change that occurred by then Republican Governor Charlie Crist, who I worked with very closely to change the rules of executive clemency. He was elected in 2006, and in virtually the first cabinet meeting that he had in the spring of 2007, changed the rules of executive clemency to allow for virtually automatic restoration for people convicted of a nonviolent felony. As a result, between April of 2007 and June of 2008, a crucial year because it was in time to vote in a 2008 presidential election, 155,000 people had their right to vote restored as a result of this change in the rules of executive clemency. But then we had a new governor, and the new governor reversed these rules of executive clemency and shut the door, and in fact made them even more restrictive. And then the campaign to change the Constitution began. And so we began this campaign to put Amendment 4 on the ballot to change the Constitution. If you were voting in Florida in 2018 when it made the ballot, this is what you voted for. The underlying portion is the new language that was added to the Constitution. And you can see that that any restriction or disqualification from voting arising from a felony conviction shall terminate upon the completion of all terms and of a sentence, including parole and probation. You notice that there is not a single mention at all about funds or payment of any fines, fees, or legal financial obligation, or anything like that. This was approved by about 2/3 of the voters in the November 2018 election. And then the legislature convenes in 2019 and gets its hands on it. And the legislature enacted House Bill 7066, which you can see what they mainly did was that they require that financial obligations have to be paid including fines, fees, court-ordered fees, and restitution before a sentence is completed. And most significantly, what they did is in that last sentence, indicating that the conversion to a civil lien, which is what is usually done, namely when your debt is sold to a debt collection agency and you are no longer under the jurisdiction of the criminal court, that's not sufficient based on this law that passed in 2019. You have to pay every penny. And so this was challenged. And on a Sunday, Judge Robert Hinkle issued a 125-page opinion basically saying that you can condition payment of fines and restitution on a person's ability to pay, but the state cannot condition voting on the payment of an amount a person is genuinely unable to pay. And what he said is that Florida created an unconstitutional pay-to-vote system. And so the governor appealed, and the 11th Circuit reversed and left in place Senate Bill 7066, which requires what the judge called a pay-to-vote system. And I'll get back to that in a second. That, I think, is the injustice that we're all now left with a significant injustice, namely that a person, it allows discrimination on the basis of wealth. Well-off offenders or offenders who can afford to pay, they can vote. Indigent offenders cannot vote, regardless of the seriousness of their crime. But secondly, and I think this is galling, I think, former offenders have a legal obligation to pay their legal financial obligations, their fines, fees, restitution, and so on. But the state has no obligation to tell them how much they owe. And there is no central database. This is the most galling injustice that is left with us by the federal appellate court, and I think has to be addressed, and it can be addressed by the legislature. At least tell people how much they owe if you're going to require a pay-to-vote system, and collect this information in one place. According to the courts, it's spread over 11 different databases. So look, that's the injustice that's left with us. But I do think that there are some significant accomplishments of what was Amendment 4. It ended the lifetime voting ban. You don't have to go beg for your voting rights anymore before the cabinet, and the cabinet, based on no standards whatsoever, can decide whether to restore your voting rights or not. And any person with a past felony conviction, except for murder or a felony sex offense, that does not have an outstanding legal financial obligation or is able to pay it, can register and vote immediately. So let me turn my attention to the third Florida thing, and that is the redistricting. So in 2010, the voters adopted what are called the fair district standards. You can see here there are 2 tiers of standards. The first one prohibits prohibits partisan gerrymandering, and the second one is a protection for the rights of minority voters. The second tier of requirements have to be consistent with the first tier of requirements. So what we have going on now in the state of Florida is that the governor is attempting to force the legislature to accept what is clearly an unconstitutional gerrymandered congressional district map. If you know anything, and we can talk more about this, he was using the typical patterns of gerrymandering. The map that he wants to shove down the throats of the legislature and now the courts packs Black voters into a Northeast Florida congressional district around Jacksonville, and cracks, that is, divide up the Black community in the Orlando area into 3 different congressional districts in order to dilute the power of the Black vote, all in order to create 2 more Republican-dominated seats. He is advancing an interesting legal theory, and I think that this particular issue in Florida is the most dangerous issue. His particular legal theory is that to draw what's called a minority access district to ensure that racial minorities have an equal opportunity to participate in the political process and elect representatives of their choice. These are legal standards that have been part of federal law for at least 6 decades and part of the Florida Constitution for at least a decade because of these fair district amendments. What he is arguing to the court, in effect, is that that standard protecting the right of minority voters is itself unconstitutionally discriminatory. If he is successful, and I have to say, in all honesty, this is why I say this is perhaps the most dangerous issue confronting us in the state of Florida right now. If he is successful, and he has, I would think, maybe at least 4 votes on the US Supreme Court for something like this, that would be the nail in the coffin of the Voting Rights Act, and it would be the end of the voter-approved fair district amendments in Florida. So let me try to conclude this quickly to a little discussion about why I think this is all happening. The first reason is that it's a response to the extraordinary turnout of the 2020 election. In the last election, 230 million Americans were eligible to vote, and 66.7 of the eligible voters actually voted. This was the highest percentage turnout of eligible voters in 120 years, since 1900. Since the 19th Amendment was enacted in 1920, giving women the right to vote, which essentially doubled the size of the electorate, turnout, even though the size of the electorate was doubled, turnout never surpassed 64%. And for the better part of the last century, fewer than 60% of eligible voters participated in elections. But again, I want to repeat, in 2020, 66.7% of eligible voters turned out. My personal view is that it was fueled by a desire to fire the incumbent president. And secondly, this is all happening when the country is dramatically polarized and facing very significant demographic changes. The electorate is becoming younger, more diverse, more multicultural, and this has caused fear. More immigration means more new Americans, and that means more new voters. The 2020 census reported that for the first time in US history, the percentage of white people actually declined. White people will soon be a minority in this country. According to the Brookings Institute, by 2040, not that far off, only 45% of the under 30-year-old population will be non-Hispanic whites. So a lot of people, you can imagine, find this very, very threatening. They see their power slipping away given demographic changes. Some will fear that it will be a while before Republicans are able to win a national popular vote. Remember, two of the last four presidents lost the popular vote and were elected by the Electoral College votes. So this is, I think, worthy of a whole separate discussion, but I'm concerned that there's a real reason to be fearful about what is the long-term impact of what in effect it might be minority rule in this country. How long will the public accept minority rule in a democracy? I want to say that this is thirdly, this is a top-down revolution. This is a revolution that is a legal revolution that is fueled by right-wing think tanks like the Heritage Foundation and the Federalist Society, all of which are very heavily funded by the Koch brothers. The adoption of voter suppression schemes accelerated after the US Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013 case of Shelby County versus Holder. And that case had an immediate impact on the 15 states that were covered in whole or in part by the Voting Rights Act, namely Alabama, Georgia, Texas, and Arizona in whole, and Florida and North Carolina in part. And the Brennan Center has reported that last year, 2021, 19 Republican-controlled states passed 34 laws, making it more difficult to vote and to depress turnout, which is really what this is all about, depressing turnout. Fourthly, we're dealing with an ascendant legal theory that I alluded to a little while ago at the US Supreme Court. There's an opposition to the use of federal power to guarantee a nationwide floor of basic rights. You can see this happening now and what the court is probably going to do with regard to abortion rights, but you certainly also see it with regard to voting rights as well. And so we're back, this is really all back to deference to states' rights. John Roberts became Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court in 2005. And since then, this U.S. Supreme Court has never struck down a state voting restriction. And in 2019, in a case called Rucho versus Common Cause, the Supreme Court ruled that claims of partisan gerrymandering, thank God we have the prohibition against this in our state constitution, but the prohibition of partisan gerrymandering are political questions beyond the reach of the federal courts. That has left voters at the mercy of state legislatures. Lastly, it's also happening because of what you've heard mainly, the need to address voter fraud and restore public confidence in elections. Of course, public confidence in elections has been undermined by a consistent, well-funded disinformation campaign that has been fostered mostly by public officials. That the 2020 election was infested with fraud. So let me conclude here, try to quickly, with the following. Suggestions for what we can do about this, and I skipped over lots, and I'm happy to go back and discuss any of this in more detail. But I want to say that, look, I am no smarter than many of you on this call. These are just my suggestions. Some are suggestions about how we should look at the problem, but how we should look at the problem is also a guide for what we can do about the problem. So here are my suggestions, and I have 10 suggestions of what we can do. Number one, I think we have to start with a realistic analysis of where we are. We are in a period of backlash and retrenchment that is led by Republican-dominated state legislatures, Republican governors, the U.S. Supreme Court, the U.S. Senate, controlled by the filibuster rules that are kept in place by Senate Republicans and 2 Democratic senators. And we can't be naive. I mean, I grew up in the ACLU saying, oh, well, the federal courts will bail us out. Don't worry, let's run into court. The federal courts will bail us out. The effect of the appointments by Bush 1 and 2, and 3 appointments by former President Trump to the U.S. Supreme Court is that the courts are no longer our saviors. In fact, they are hostile to federal protection of basic rights. I mentioned abortion and voting rights as examples. What we need is congressional passage of the reenacted Voting Rights Act of 1965. Until the 2013 Supreme Court decision, sections 4 and 5 that required pre-clearance by the U.S. Department of Justice for voting changes in voting laws and procedures in jurisdictions with a history of voting discrimination, that was the heart and soul of the Voting Rights Act. And because of that, we had 48 years of voting rights protection, and the pre-clearance provision was the most essential part of the Voting Rights Act. But that's all gone. And as I said, we're in a period of retrenchment and backlash. But I want to say that a realistic analysis should not lead to defeatism. Even after the 2010 Tea Party revolution, when state legislatures, including Florida's, were taken over by very, very conservative elements, we still were able to see an expansion of voting rights. It was still possible. We secured electronic voter registration. We had the adoption or the expansion of early voting, and the conversion, I mentioned earlier, of absentee voting, where you needed an excuse, to no excuse vote by mail. So a realistic analysis should not lead to defeatism. Thirdly, we have to maintain the passion for voting rights and be inspired by those who came before us. Take inspiration from those who fought for equal rights for women, including Abigail Adams. Remember her famous letter to her husband, John, and to those who fought for the passage of the 19th Amendment who were routinely arrested and suffered brutal treatment while in jail. I thought you might like to see. This is a memento that I have. This was something that was put in the window by the suffragettes who successfully fought for the 19th Amendment adopted in 1920 to proudly put in their window that there is a woman here who is registered to vote. So the memento of that. We need to take inspiration from, think of the students that went to Mississippi for Freedom Summer in 1964 and who risked their lives to register people to vote, including James Chaney, although he was from the South, but Michael Schreiner and Andrew Goodman from New York, one of whom was from my school, and who were murdered in Mississippi in 1964. And lastly, you got to take inspiration from former Congressman John Lewis, who at such a young age, imagine his young age, standing at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, confronting Alabama state troopers on horseback. I mean, that was just miraculous and as I say, inspirational. This is one of the mementos that I brought back from the time that I spent in Selma. So take inspiration of the young people that changed America during the Civil Rights Movement. We need to organize to speed the end of this backlash and retrenchment. I mean, think of those who were organizing before there was a civil rights movement. Think about the odds that they faced. I mean, greater than I think we face now, greater. Look, the federal government was uninterested in protecting the voting rights of minority groups. The Democratic Party couldn't afford to alienate its southern base. The federal law enforcement, namely the FBI, were hostile to civil rights workers. And much of local law enforcement in the South were infiltrated by the Klan and the White Citizens Council. And against these odds and brutal violence, people worked to build a mass movement to strengthen organizations and coalitions. And that's the lesson that I think we need to act upon. We need to build and strengthen organizations, whether they're church social action committees or labor unions or other progressive groups, and work to build interracial coalitions. And I want to say coalitions that align the interests of white collar and blue collar workers. Next, I operate with the belief, maybe it's a faith, but it's a belief, that turnout can beat suppression. Right-wing groups like the Heritage Foundation, they understand that, and that's why their model laws attempt to shrink the electorate. So I think we need to work to increase vote by mail, voter registration signups for young voters, for new voters, and new Americans. Remember, if you are new to Florida, or you have a short memory about what happened in Florida, the last 3 gubernatorial elections in Florida, 2 for Rick Scott and 1 for Ron DeSantis, were decided by approximately 30,000 votes. That's about 5 per precinct, less than 1%. Turnout can beat suppression if we work harder. Here's my next suggestion. Sign up with the SOE, your supervisor election, to become a poll worker. Not a poll watcher, that's for the parties and the candidates. Poll worker, you're working for and you get paid by the supervisor of elections. You can ensure efficiency, and you can also help resist aggressive poll watching challenges that try to turn voters away or require that they vote a provisional rather than a regular ballot. I think we have to make election and voting issues major issues in this election, question candidates, use candidate surveys, question candidates at town hall meetings, ask them what their position is on these restrictions on vote by mail, and what they are prepared to do to end the disgraceful pay to vote system in Florida. Be strategic. What I mean by that is at the state level, work for changes that are most likely to increase turnout. That means primarily work for automatic voter registration and for same-day voter registration. You know, money is everything. Donate to organizations. I have the word progressive in there, but really what I mean is donate to organizations that prioritize working on voting rights. Without a defense of voting rights, all other goals are not going to be possible. And lastly, there's no way of avoiding it. You have to engage in partisan electoral politics. If you want to change public policies, I mean, look at the 2 votes short that was that the Senate fell to adopt the John Lewis Voting Rights Act changes. But if you want to change public policy, you're going to have to change the policy makers. So I'm sorry for running over. I hope we have at least 10, 15 minutes or so. I'm at Larry's disposal. Thank you so much for your patience, and let's have a reasonably good discussion about all this.
Thank you, Howard. I'm going to go to the Q&As now and see if anybody put a Q or an A in. And if you haven't and you're still there, please type one in. So one of the questions is, I have to read this. How does the Board of Elections know whether a convicted felon's sentence has been completed or whether they actually owe something if the state won't tell people how much they owe? Does the state simply answer yes or no when the county asks the person to register as a convicted felon or whether he still owes like money? So how?
Well, I think the short answer to that is, and I'll be short about that, you know, as I said before, this is the courts. There's another whole story how this happened, because I think there's a scandal. I can talk about that in a little bit, but the federal judge's decision was reversed by a 6-4 vote. That's a 2-vote margin. Those 2 votes were people that DeSantis recommended to Trump. Whether they should have even participated in that decision is, I think, a real ethical problem, and I can describe why in a second. But this is the scandalous situation that this court left us with, this pay-to-vote system. I think the short answer to your question is, how will the supervisor know? That's not how the system works in Florida. The supervisor will not know. The threat is to the individual, because if the individual votes when they are not eligible to vote, that is yet another felony, and that is the threat of a felony, and then the threat to be sent back to jail. So the threat mechanism or the information mechanism is not information to the SOE, it's a threat to the voter.
Okay, but can I ask, I haven't thought about this. So what you're saying is, how would the state know if
a former felon shows up who sincerely believes, whether correctly or incorrectly, but sincerely believes that you know, they paid all their outstanding fees and fines and restitution and so on, and registers and shows up to vote, the supervisor has no way of knowing whether that's true or not.
But how would they? You said that he or she's taking a risk. How would they ever be uncovered? How would they be discovered?
You know, several years later, the Secretary of State, well, wait a minute, I'm sorry. I have to amend what I said. I have to amend what I said, because the Secretary of State will have these ultimate records, and the Secretary of State could essentially do a case-by-case evaluation. But one thing that's going to facilitate that is that in the last session of the legislature, I had to glance over a bunch of things, too much information that I have here. But one of the provisions of the voting restriction law that was passed in the last session of the legislature was to equip the governor of the state of Florida with an election police force of, I forgot, maybe 40 people. So they will now be able to, they won't be able to do it on election day, but they will be able to do it on a case by case. It might take them a year and so on. But there is the threat that if you vote and you're not eligible, look, this is all about, as I say, trying to depress turnout. And if you hold the threat of another felony conviction over somebody's head, they're probably not likely to vote.
Something I had never thought about, but thank you. Now, we also have a question from Abe Levy, who says, how do you maintain hope? Sounds like me, as democracy has been placed on the defensive in so many ways, and we can no longer depend on the courts to save it. Do you still have hope, Howard?
Well, God, if you think about or go back over what I said, frankly, the two things I want to say about that. First of all, again, I think about the college students who I grew up with in the early 60s, and think about the odds that they faced, lynching and murder and so on. I mean, they faced much more brutal circumstances that we do now. So I think if you think about everything that I said, I think, frankly, in answer to the question, I think a lot of what I said is that what's happening in this country on this issue of voting rights, it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. There may be a big step back right now, but it's still 2 steps forward and 1 step back. There's a lot of, look, there's no doubt about the progress. Look, I worked for 19 years since the 2000 election on 18 years, I'm sorry, on the ending the system of lifetime felon disfranchisement, which if you lived in Florida, you read stories that every time the cabinet met, people had to go up to Tallahassee, hat in hand, on bended knee, and tell them that they were worthy, that they went to church every Sunday, that they raised it, and so on, and begged for their voting rights to be restored. That system is gone. That, thank God we got that, just to take one example of 2 steps forward and 1 step back.
Anybody else out there wants to ask a question before we call it a day? Well, if not, I'd like to thank Howard for taking the time, preparing a slew of PowerPoints and joining us. And I think we'll try to talk him into coming to some live presentations or giving one when they resume. So I thank everybody, and until next time, thank you very much.
Thank you.